That glowing gas $6 sign isn't just a number, it's a message. And it's basically daring you to ask the obvious question: if America is swimming in oil, why does filling up still feel like a punishment? Somewhere out in West Texas, pump jacks keep nodding in the heat, like they're agreeing with every politician who says, "We're energy independent now." But your receipt at the gas station is telling a very different story. Here's the part that messes with your head. The United States is the world's biggest oil producer, beating Saudi Arabia, beating Russia, and still acting like cheap gas is some rare luxury. So what if the cheap oil story is a myth we repeat because we want it to be true? The same way people keep saying a diet starts tomorrow while ordering fries today. What if the real plan, quietly, strategically, and kind of brutally, is to burn through everyone else's cheap oil first and save America's hardest, most expensive barrels for the moment the world has no other choice? In 2025, the U.S. hit a record, 13.61 million barrels a day, a number so big it sounds like a typo until you see it in black and white in energy reports and headlines. That record became a victory lap. Press conferences, cable news graphics, and that familiar line, "We're the top producer, so we control our destiny." Like the story ends right there. But then 2026 shows up with a colder tone, because the same kind of sources that celebrate records, think EIA-style forecasts, start warning that production could slip instead of climbing. And the weird thing is, it's not because America suddenly forgot how to drill. It's because the best parts of the shale boom aren't infinite, and the math starts getting ugly when the easy wins run out. The center of this whole machine is the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico, and the whispers you hear from people watching it closely sound less like limitless and more like we're hitting the edges of the sweet spot. If you've never been to the Permian, picture a giant industrial patchwork. Sand trucks, pipelines, flare stacks in the distance, and crews moving with the urgency of a place that knows every day of peak output is borrowed time. When shale is young and the best acreage is fresh, production can surge fast. But shale wells decline fast too, like opening a soda bottle that blasts at first and then goes flat quicker than you expected. So companies keep drilling to replace what's declining, and that's where you start hearing about rig counts dropping, efficiency gains slowing, and executives using careful language that basically means we can't cheat geology forever. Meanwhile, America is also playing firefighter for the world, shipping fuel and filling gaps when other supplies get disrupted, and that global role quietly puts more stress on the home engine. So even while the country is number one, it can still feel like you're living in a house with the biggest water tank on the block and a leaky pipe that keeps your shower cold. Now we get to the part nobody likes saying out loud. Not all oil costs the same to pull out of the ground, and the U.S. barrel is often the most expensive barrel in the room. Saudi oil, in the simplest terms, is famous for being cheap to produce. Numbers around $3 a barrel get thrown around, because in many places, it's like sticking a straw into a thick milkshake. U.S. shale is the opposite. It's oil trapped in tight rock, and getting it out is more like trying to squeeze water out of a brick using pressure, chemistry, and a lot of very expensive equipment.
Line on the Animum upward from
break-even numbers for new shale wells that land near about $70 per barrel around 2026, and why some projections push that toward $95 by 2030 as the easiest drilling locations get used up. So when someone tells you America has cheap oil, you should hear the translation. We have a lot of oil, but much of it is steak dinner oil, not dollar menu oil. And that difference is exactly why your gas price doesn't magically obey political slogans.
And
now,
where's the discount?
Where it gets even more counterintuitive. Oil is priced globally. So even if the barrel came from a field in Texas, it's still competing in a worldwide auction. That means a refinery in Louisiana doesn't get a locals discount just because the oil was pumped on U.S. soil.
Diagers
And
on
those
switch modes
refineries,
and
they're
highlight
not
different pathways
magical
that
turn
its
any
lungs to as
crude into cheap
fragment
gas
might the
machines.
spread
A
Bellwooth
lot of
and
them were
rebuild
built and
Stein in
upgraded to
for
handle
Pharaoh
certain
Screen.
kinds of crude. And when the mix changes, lighter shale here, heavier imports there, the whole system has to adapt, and adaptation costs money.
Into the
Then
final
there's the
total.
uncomfortable truth that gas prices aren't just crude oil plus a little profit. They're crude, refining, transportation, retail margins, and taxes, all piled into one number that hits you in the gut when you're standing there at the pump. So when you see prices jump overnight, it's often not because someone flipped a villain switch. It's because one part of that chain tightened. Maybe a refinery went down, maybe shipping got snarled, maybe demand spiked, and the whole line of dominoes fell fast. If you want a vivid example, think about what happens when a major refinery has an unexpected outage. Even if crude prices barely move, the cost of the finished product can jump, because suddenly everyone's fighting over a smaller pool of gasoline and diesel. And that's why drill more is not the same thing as pay less tomorrow. More drilling increases supply over time, but it doesn't instantly create refining capacity, extra pipelines, more storage tanks, or more truck drivers to move fuel where it's needed. Now, layer in the fact that U.S. producers aren't a single national company taking orders from Washington. They're thousands of firms and investors, and their first question isn't, what does the country need? It's, will this investment pay off? After the 2014 crash and the 2020 collapse, a lot of executives learned a painful lesson. Chasing growth at any cost can get you fired. So instead of flooding the market with new drilling, many companies started prioritizing dividends, buybacks, and capital discipline, which is a polite way of saying we're not drilling like maniacs anymore. That shift changes everything, because shale's superpower was speed. If Wall Street stops rewarding speed, the boom becomes a slower, more cautious machine, even if the rocks still hold oil. And then comes the strategic question that sounds like conspiracy until you realize governments have always thought this way. What is oil actually for? Is it just for cheap commutes and road trips? Or is it a national security asset you don't want to waste when the world gets desperate? Imagine you're running a household during a long blackout and you've got a generator with limited fuel. You don't burn it all on comfort in the first week. You ration it for the moment the storm gets worse. That's the logic behind the idea of burning everyone else's cheap oil first, because a lot of the world's cheapest barrels sit under countries that can produce them with lower costs and sometimes fewer constraints. From a cold strategic angle, letting those barrels flow while you preserve your harder barrels can look like patience, not weakness. But patience has a price, because the U.S. economy is built on movement. Trucks, planes, shipping, commuting, deliveries that show up in tutis like it's a law of nature. When fuel gets expensive, it's not just your wallet, it's the entire cost structure of modern life. So policymakers get trapped in a contradiction. They want cheap energy for voters today, but they also want resilience for the country tomorrow. And the scary part is that you can't fully have both at the same time. This is where the Strategic Petroleum Reserve enters the conversation, because it's basically the nation's emergency pantry. When prices spike or supply gets threatened, releasing barrels can calm the market. But every release is also a reminder that the pantry isn't infinite. If you've ever watched people shop before a hurricane, you know the psychology. Once shelves start looking thin, everyone gets jumpy. Oil markets have the same nerves, and nerves can move prices just as fast as actual shortages. Now, zoom out from the US and you see why the global system feels so tense. When demand is high, spare capacity is low, and political risk is everywhere, the market starts pricing in fear, not just fuel. So what happens if U.S. production really does dip after a record year, even by a few 100,000 barrels a day? In a tight market, that small dip can feel huge because it removes the cushion everyone assumed would be there. And the Permian can't just keep saving the day forever, because drilling isn't a video game where you unlock endless new levels. The best acreage gets drilled first, and what's left is often more complex, more expensive, and less forgiving. At the same time, other major producers play their own chess game. If a low-cost producer can open the taps, it can pressure prices downward. But if it restrains supply, it can keep prices high enough to fund its own national priorities. That's why who has cheap oil becomes who can afford to wait, and those aren't the same thing. A country with low production costs can tolerate lower prices longer, while high-cost producers need higher prices just to stay in motion. And that brings us back to the U.S. shale business model. It's fast, flexible, and brutally dependent on price. If prices fall too far, drilling slows, production declines, and the market tightens again, like a thermostat that keeps overshooting and correcting. You can feel this in the way executives talk when they're being careful. They'll say things like inventory depth, Tier 1 locations, and return thresholds. But what they're really saying is, we don't have infinite cheap wells left. Meanwhile, the average driver experiences all of this as a mood swing at the pump. One month, you're relaxed. The next month, you're doing mental math in the parking lot, asking yourself whether you really need that extra trip across town. So here's a question for you. If cheap oil is mostly elsewhere, and America's marginal barrels are expensive, what should the goal actually be? Is it cheapest gas possible? Or is it stable energy that doesn't collapse the economy when the world gets messy? A lot of people assume the answer is simply produce more, but stability often comes from diversity, not just volume. More supply helps, sure, but so do efficiency, resilient infrastructure, smarter demand, and alternatives that reduce how often oil gets the final vote.
Out one
And
trip
yes,
on a weekly
alternatives
plan,
can
and
sound
then
like a lecture
circles 10%
until you
plan,
see the numbers.
slides the transit card
If a
cloth rest
household
to the
cuts fuel
keys.
use by even 10% through better mileage, fewer trips, or different vehicles, that's real money. And it also reduces the panic sensitivity of the whole system. On the industrial side, the stakes are bigger. Trucking fleets, shipping routes, airline fuel hedges, and manufacturing costs. When oil becomes unpredictable, every business starts building just-in-case costs into prices, and that's how energy shocks quietly become grocery shocks. Now, think about the future scenario that keeps planners up at night. A world where demand stays stubbornly high, but the easiest barrels decline. In that world, the most valuable oil isn't the cheapest oil. It's the oil you can still access when everyone else can't. That's the darkest version of the save our expensive oil idea. Not that anyone wants pain, but that maintaining domestic capability is a hedge against a world that might not stay friendly. Because if global supply gets disrupted, having your own production, even expensive production, can be the difference between a recession and a manageable squeeze. But there's a trade-off, and it's not abstract. Every time domestic drilling expands, communities argue about land, water, air quality, and the industrial footprint, and those fights shape what's politically possible. So the U.S. is constantly negotiating with itself: energy security versus environmental cost, short-term price relief versus long-term resilience. And that negotiation doesn't happen in a calm room. It happens during elections, during crises, and during the exact moments when people are least patient. Now, let's bring it back to your original frustration at the pump, because that's where all these forces become personal. You're not paying for American oil, you're paying for a global commodity, processed through a system with real bottlenecks and real limits. And when someone promises you permanent cheap gas, they're usually selling a feeling, not a plan. Because cheap gas isn't just about geology. It's about infrastructure, investment cycles, global politics, and how much spare capacity the world is willing to keep idle. So here's the conclusion that's honest, even if it's not comforting. America has a lot of oil, but much of the remaining growth is expensive, and the rest of the world still sets the stage where prices are decided. That doesn't mean the U.S. is doomed, and it doesn't mean energy independence is meaningless. It means independence is more like having options in a crisis than it is like getting a permanent discount code for your gas station. If the world burns through the cheapest barrels first, the late game belongs to whoever still has capacity, technology, and the political stability to produce under pressure. And in that late game, the U.S. advantage might not be cheap, but available. So next time you see that glowing price sign, consider what it's really measuring. It's not just the cost of a gallon. It's the cost of a global system balancing comfort today against security tomorrow, and asking all of us, quietly, what we're willing to pay for either one.